What if I told you a nearly invisible crack could bring down one of the world's largest planes? It sounds impossible, but on August 12, 1985, Japan Airlines Flight 123 faced just that. A tiny, overlooked flaw that led to the deadliest single aircraft disaster in aviation history. Out of 524 people on board, only 4 survived. How could this happen? What went so catastrophically wrong? Today, we're talking about the tragic, complex, and shocking story of Japan Air 123. It's a humid evening on August 12, 1985, at Tokyo's Haneda Airport. Japan Airlines Flight 123, a scheduled domestic flight to Osaka, is prepping for departure with 524 souls on board, including families, business people, and even children excited for their quick, routine trip. The Boeing 747 SR model was built specifically for Japan's densely populated domestic market. It's like a giant bus in the sky, carrying double the capacity of standard jets for shorter, frequent trips across Japan's islands. Because these planes were in constant use, maintenance could sometimes be rushed, even stretched thin. This particular 747 had been through a lot in its lifetime, including an accident 7 years earlier, a tail strike in 1978. The plane's tail hit the runway during a hard landing, causing structural damage to the rear pressure bulkhead. Now, this bulkhead might seem like an afterthought to an amateur, but it's critical for a plane's safety. It's literally the component that keeps pressurized air inside the cabin at high altitudes. Without it, the plane would be uninhabitable at cruising heights. Fast forward to that August evening in 1985. The crew and passengers have no idea that this seemingly routine flight will turn into one of aviation's greatest tragedies. 12 minutes into the flight, at around 6:24 p.m., the plane is cruising smoothly at 24,000 feet. Suddenly, passengers and crew hear a loud boom. Oxygen masks drop, confusion spreads, and the plane begins to lose altitude. What actually happened? That rear pressure bulkhead, the one that had been improperly repaired after the tail strike, finally gave way. Think of it as a dam bursting. The once contained cabin air pressure suddenly had nowhere to go, and it exploded outward, taking part of the tail with it. When this bulkhead ruptured, the pressurized air ripped open a section of the tail, causing an explosive decompression. A little more about decompression in aviation. Planes are designed to keep the cabin at a safe pressure level for humans. Without it, at these high altitudes, we simply cannot breathe normally. The human body isn't made for these conditions, so when decompression occurs, it becomes a matter of seconds before panic and physical distress set in. With the pressure bulkhead gone, something even worse happens: a complete hydraulic failure. Captain Takahama, First Officer Yutaka Sasaki, and Flight Engineer Hiroshi Fukuda are all highly experienced, but now, they are facing an impossible task. In modern aviation, the hydraulics are the very lifeblood of the plane's control mechanisms. They control everything from wing flaps to rudders. When these systems failed, the crew was effectively steering blind. So what do you do when you have no control? You get creative. Captain Takahama starts improvising, using only the plane's engines to steer, a technique so risky it's almost unheard of. Imagine trying to drive a car that only responds when you press the gas or brake, but the steering wheel does nothing. That's essentially what these pilots were attempting, except with 300 tons of machinery and hundreds of lives in their hands. They'd increase thrust on one engine to make the plane turn one way, then reduce thrust on the other to adjust. They somehow managed to stabilize the plane temporarily, but every small adjustment brings unpredictable results. The flight deck recorder captures some heart-wrenching moments here. Captain Takahama and his team are clearly aware that the situation is spiraling out of control, but they remain calm, trying maneuver after maneuver. As the crew struggles to maintain control, Captain Takahama finally sends out distress calls to air traffic control, hoping someone on the ground understands the urgency. But here's where things get even more tragic. Communication barriers, delays, and incomplete information make it nearly impossible for ground control to fully grasp the crisis on board. Imagine being on a flight where your only lifeline, communication with the ground, isn't available to help you. The crew repeatedly radios their situation, but the responses they receive only add to the chaos. Through the flight recorder, we hear the pilot's voice growing more urgent with every transmission. The ground control tries to interpret their cryptic messages, but they have incomplete data on what's happening inside the plane. On board, though, it's as real as it gets. The lack of real-time information leaves both the pilots and ground control in the dark. They can only hope someone's hearing them clearly, and fast. With the hydraulics completely shot and the engines offering limited control, the Boeing 747's movements become increasingly erratic as it begins a slow, unpredictable descent toward the mountainous terrain below. At this point, there's little the crew can do. Their attempts to control the descent become weaker as the plane's erratic path draws closer to the mountains of Gunma Prefecture. In the cabin, time seems to stretch out as each moment ticks closer to impact. Just minutes before the inevitable crash, there's an eerie silence from the cockpit, as if everyone inside has made peace with what's coming. A slow, painful realization of what was about to happen. These last few moments are often described as the calm before the storm. But for those on board, it was anything but calm. After the devastating crash, all that's left is silence and the smoking wreckage of Flight 123. Incredibly, though, out of the 524 people aboard, 4 individuals survived the initial impact: a young girl, 2 women, and a man. Survival is one thing, but enduring the aftermath is another. These 4 survivors spent the night in excruciating pain, surrounded by twisted metal and the tragic loss of hundreds of others. The terrain was so remote and the crash so catastrophic that rescue efforts were delayed. Tragically, help wouldn't arrive until early the next morning. The Japanese self-defense forces were initially misdirected to the wrong location, adding to the heartbreak of the situation. For the 4 survivors, and possibly others who initially survived the crash but succumbed overnight, the delay proved fatal. Can you imagine being injured, in shock, and waiting through a cold, dark night for help that isn't coming? Knowing that lives could have been saved if only the rescue had been quicker. After the disaster, investigators launched an extensive review to understand why Flight 123 failed so catastrophically. Eventually, they traced it back to that faulty 1978 repair on the rear pressure bulkhead. The bulkhead repair had been carried out improperly. A single doubler plate had been used instead of 2, leaving it vulnerable to metal fatigue. Over the years, each flight added more and more stress, slowly weakening the bulkhead until it finally gave way on that fateful August day. This is the haunting part. An error in repair, a single oversight, had set in motion a ticking time bomb that would go off 7 years later, claiming over 500 lives. Just tells you how crucial attention to detail is in aviation, where even the smallest misstep can lead to unimaginable consequences. When investigators recovered the black box, it held haunting audio from the cockpit, capturing the crew's desperate attempts to control the situation. The recordings revealed Captain Takahama's calm professionalism, First Officer Sasaki's quick problem-solving, and Flight Engineer Fukuda's persistent efforts, despite knowing their options were slipping away. These final moments gave us a clear picture of courage. The aftermath of the investigation led to sweeping changes across the aviation industry, particularly around maintenance protocols, inspection standards, and emergency response systems. For Japan Airlines and Boeing, this incident triggered a complete overhaul in how bulkhead repairs and other structural fixes were handled. The industry also tightened up its protocols for reporting and tracking maintenance, especially on high-frequency flight paths like those in Japan. But beyond technical changes, Japan Airlines Flight 123 left a cultural legacy, a grim reminder of the stakes in the world of aviation. The disaster urged airlines to constantly review safety standards, making today's skies safer. The 4 survivors faced a lifetime of physical and emotional scars. One of them, a young girl at the time, later spoke out about how the trauma reshaped her life, giving her a deep appreciation for survival, but also leaving a lasting shadow of loss. And that's a wrap. May the lives lost in this disaster be forever remembered, not just in the annals of history, but in the constant, meticulous work that keeps today's skies safe. So, what do you think was the most shocking part of this tragedy? Do you think incidents like this can still happen? Or have we learned enough? Drop your comments below. Before you go, don't forget to check out my recent video, New Plane Suffers Triple Engine Failure, Pilot Saves the Day. Keep flying high with us. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and be ready for more stories that defy the skies.